Thank you for having me. Great to be here. I want to pick up, I guess, on some of the themes that Professor Chubbs just touched on, because I think I have very similar views. What I'd like to do is really talk about some of the constraints in the system, the structural constraints, that universities and industry are going to have to overcome in order to scale the kinds of activities that we're talking about. Generally, as a data scientist, I am very chart heavy in my presentations. Today I've gone for a different approach, which is to simply share some numbers with you. 4,082,522,047. Any guesses? Didn't think so. So this is the difference between university research revenue and university research expenditure. There's a deficit of around $4.08 billion in terms of what revenue universities receive to do research and what they spend on doing research. That's the current business model. Those data are from 2016. 22 and 13. This is the cents in the dollar that is currently and going to be returned by the federal government to cover the overhead costs of university-based research under the research block grants in the current model and the model going forward. In other words, that deficit potentially is going to get a lot larger, and universities are going to incur much larger overheads that have to be covered from some other source. This matters for a number of reasons. In my view, as a business model, that doesn't stack up and that's not sustainable. In any company, if you are underwriting a $4 billion loss year on year, and every sign was that it was going to increase, you would not sustain that business unit. And yet, this is a fundamental part of our innovation ecosystem in Australia. The entire business model is underwritten by international student revenue. And if you stop and think about the logic of that for a moment and say out loud, Australia's research endeavour is underpinned by the revenue from Chinese and Indian student markets. Again, logically, it doesn't make sense if you were to design a research and innovation system from the ground up, you wouldn't say that's how we're going to build it. And finally, with recent changes to the research block grants, recent changes around the measurement of impact and engagement, federal government has clearly flagged that they want universities to diversify away from a dependency on federal government funding of research. In other words, additional industry funding is necessary in order to prop up the research that goes on inside of universities, in order to A, create a sustainable business model or something nearing a more sustainable business model, and B, in order to cover the shortfall that's coming in terms of changes to government funding policies. 2,313,291. The number of Australian businesses operating as of June 2018. 62. The percentage of Australian businesses that were non-employing as at June 2018. 2.5 is the percentage of Australian businesses that employed more than 20 people as at June 2018. 71.5 of all the employing Australian businesses, and remember that's just a small proportion, 71.5% of Australian businesses that employed between 1 and 4 people. 3,932, the number of Australian businesses that employed more than 200 people. Why does it matter? Government is asking universities and demanding and mandating through policy mechanisms that universities go out and seek additional funding from the private sector. My question is, who in the private sector are we actually talking about? There is only a very small number, 2,300 or so, large businesses employing more than 200 people in this country who will have the in-house capacity to do things like have a legal department, have a project manager, have an R&D manager, be able to negotiate IP contracts and licenses with a university. Small to medium enterprises employing 20 people or less will not have those capabilities and that capacity in-house to dedicate to working with Australian universities. The other thing I think that we need to bear in mind is that there are probably two different requirements here amongst large corporations and small to medium enterprises, where small to medium enterprises might be looking for smaller scale projects, might have constraints around cash flow and access to cash to contribute to R&D projects with universities. They may be looking for discrete problem-focused engagements, whereas large corporations like Telstra, etc., may be able to actually tap into the deep discovery and breakthrough research that goes on in universities and that universities are built around, particularly GO8s like Monash. So we have to think about this engagement thing as a spectrum, from problem solving, targeted, industry-driven up one end to discovery, breakthrough, innovation down the other end. Minus 0.6. Anyone paying attention to Ian's talk and good with numbers can guess this one. The average percentage growth of Australian business expenditure on research and development from 2010 to 2018. Large downturn of around 12% recently, driven largely by downturn in the mining sector, bouncing back on investment in manufacturing recently and scientific and technical sectors. But the long-term outlook is a contracting business expenditure on research and development. 57. The Australian Institute of Company Directors came out with a survey last week. 57 is the percentage of company directors that indicated that innovation has never been or was only an occasional board agenda item. 57. I do think this might be the same 57%. Percentage of company directors that indicated they did not know how much their organisation spends on R&D and innovation. In other words, R&D and innovation, if we take the AICD survey results to be representative, is not on the agenda of boards in Australia's companies. This one I had to frame up awkwardly because it didn't fit on screen. 11,049.8 million. The average 2018 R&D spend in euros of the global top 10 R&D spending countries in the world. Led by Samsung, second I think is Alphabet. 279.3 million. Any guesses on this one? The average 2018 R&D spend of Australia's top 10 spending R&D companies led by Telstra. Why does it matter? So there is a magnitude of difference, an order of magnitude difference between global top spending R&D firms and Australian top spending R&D firms, which to me says that Australian universities, at some point, again, 2,300 large Australian firms, on average spending about $270 million in the top echelons and sliding down to much less than that when we get towards the bottom of those 2,000 or so companies. That market is potentially already saturated. I imagine, I know for a fact, that most of the top 10, all of the top 10, plus a lot of the others that come in the top 100, 200, 300 are already collaborating with universities in one way or another. The expectation that they will do more collaboration is only going to get us so far. In order to address that deficit that we talked about at the beginning of this, in order to prop up the entire research enterprise inside of universities and to reimagine the business model, is going to necessitate Australian universities looking outside of Australia in order to attract R&D spending into Australian universities. The question then becomes, if our publicly funded universities, and even if they're becoming less publicly funded over time, the core capability and competency and infrastructure has all been funded on the back of public expenditure. If they are more and more delivering value to companies that are going to capture and realise that value offshore, that are going to create jobs offshore, that are going to be taxed offshore, how do we ensure that some of that value is captured back for the Australian community? 33 and 58. The percentage of Australian researchers working in business and universities respectively, according to the OECD. 33% working in business, 58% working in universities. 84-15. The same numbers for Korea. So Korea has 84% of their researchers employed in the private sector. That correlates very tightly with increases in business expenditure on R&D. If you have more researchers working in industry, industry spends more money on research. It makes sense. 80-11, the same numbers, but for Israel. If you go through all of the countries in the OECD that we would consider to be innovation-driven or technology-based or knowledge economies, the split looks something like that. Down to about Germany, which is about 60% working in the private sector. Australia lives down the other end of this chart. That's not necessarily a problem, but that's a constraint in terms of businesses' capacity to engage with Australian universities. Australian businesses, because of that employment profile, have limited absorptive capacity. They find it difficult, without researchers employed inside of business, to access research, which is tied up in university libraries and databases that are subscription only. Difficult then to understand that research. If you're not a researcher, it's almost impossible to understand research. Difficult then to apply the lessons of that research in your company and derive value for your company. What we require in order to address that are long-term structural changes to the workforce, i.e. more researchers employed inside of businesses, but that's generations of change that needs to occur. The question is what can be done in the short term. There are exchange programs, there are industry-based PhDs emerging, there are a range of short-term solutions to some of this, but is that going to scale to the level that we want it to? 3,215, number of active licenses, options and assignments in Australian universities in 2016. 811 is the number of those that yielded revenue for universities. Didn't ask anyone if they can guess this. 196,698 is the average value of those revenue yielding licenses. In other words, all of the activity inside of Australia's universities around licensing intellectual property to the private sector, A, is quite limited, 811 revenue yielding licenses, and B, is not particularly lucrative. Again, in the context of a large deficit between research revenue and research expenditure, the current level of activity around research commercialisation is not going to go a long way to addressing the gap. 46, the number of startup companies created by Australian universities in 2016. That's one and a very small fraction per university of startups sent out into the ecosystem to be high innovation companies. Again, if we think about the model that funds university research, and if we're thinking about ways to try and address that, this scale of activity is not going to get us anywhere near the $4 billion that we need to address. 125,803,046, the total research equity holdings of Australian universities in 2016. These are the sum total of the commercialisation equity tied up inside of Australian universities. Divided by 40, more or less, universities. Again, it's not a large amount of money that's coming off the back of those commercial activities. So why does it matter? Ian said at the start of his talk, I think what we need to talk about is how do we start to come up with scalable solutions. Australian universities have answered the call in terms of being more focused on industry engagement. The amount of activity that I've seen from about 2016, when the changes to the research block grants were announced through the Watt Review, through until now, has been significant. We're talking about it. There's activity. The category 2 through 4 research revenue has gone through the roof, and I'm assured by colleagues in research offices that it's going to climb even more across the last 12 to 18 months. So the activity is picking up. There's a lot of effort going into this from universities. But my contention is that the current models that we have in place to do this are not scalable. any model which says we need to employ one more technology transfer officer or one more commercialisation officer or one more project officer in order to create more activity is not a scalable solution. One person at a time is not scaling. We need to understand and come up with new models of technology transfer and commercialisation, new models of how to engage with industry partners. We can talk about maybe some of the alternatives that are out there in the panel discussion, but this is my contention. We need to think about the modes and the models that we do these activities through. Now, I've got one final figure, just because of the nature of the gathering today, which is 3. I have a team working with me in the R&D Advisory practice at KPMG of 11 people. 3 of them have PhDs in chemistry. We've got 1 polymers, 1 nano, and 1, I can't remember off the top of my head. But just to say to people out there, your skills are valued inside an organisation like KPMG. Coming and thinking about these problems and helping from that perspective to come up with solutions is highly valuable. Thanks.